Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build these 15mm scale Sexton Mark II self-propelled artillery by the Plastic Soldier Company, so these are obviously plastic models. Before going too far, I want to say a massive thank you to Fog of War, who was kind enough to send me this box. If you haven't heard of Fog of War, he makes very good videos, predominantly about Flames of War and 15mm scale stuff. In fact, he did a video on this kit too. I'll link it in the description and in the upper right corner of the screen now. Fog of War often includes more historical and gameplay relevant information than I do, so if you're into that, I would encourage you to go and check him out and give him a sub. It's definitely worth it. The back of the box is pretty standard for a Plastic Soldier Company kit. There's a basic painting guide with callouts for a couple of Vallejo colours, and a little bit of information on what comes in the box. That's about all we need, really. The important stuff is inside. There's a single sprue here for each Sexton, there being 5 of those in the box. The plastic in this kit is pretty decent looking, and the parts are fairly neat and crisp. I don't see any moulding defects, or deformities or anything like that. There are of course some mould lines, but when aren't there mould lines? Some of them will need a bit more cleanup than others, but none of them are especially bad. The worst mould lines are on the crew figures, which you might have noticed are included on this sprue. I don't normally put the crew in my vehicles, but in this case I figured, why not? Like with all Plastic Soldier Company kits, this one doesn't include decals, which I've always thought was a bit of a shame. The Plastic Soldier Company do make decals and they're pretty decent, you just have to buy them separately. What is included is this piece of paper. It has a sprue diagram with a parts callout for the specific parts needed to make either an early Sexton in the red or a late Sexton in blue. There's also an example of each version, though they do look very similar. On the other side are the instructions. These are simple enough and shouldn't be too hard to follow at all. I like that words are included in the instructions. That's not always the case, but they can be helpful. Now, let's use these instructions to build an early Sexton. There really isn't much difference between the early and late version, but the track sets for the late version have missing guide horns on the inside of the tracks for some reason, which looks a bit weird and I'm not really sure what the reason for that is. The early version tracks don't have that issue, so I went with those. The first step in building this model is to attach the track sets to the base, but before doing that we have to trim off this excess plastic on the back. I'm not sure why that's there, but it is. It's easy enough to remove though, so there's no sense worrying too much about it. Once the parts have been neatened up, it's easy enough to glue the tracks into place. There is keying for them, but it's the same for both sides of the vehicle, so it would be very easy to put these on backwards. I won't stop you if that's what you want to do, but it will look kind of silly. Place the drive sprocket at the front of the vehicle like I have done here. Next I glue the driver figure into this engine deck interior part, whatever you might call that. The driver has no legs, so I'm not really sure how he's going to drive the Sexton, but that's for him and his crew to work out. The figure is very easy to glue into place. I do usually omit crew figures, but this time I figured I might as well include the driver at least. And if you do want to put the driver in, now is pretty much the only chance. It will be hard, or more likely impossible, to put him in once the vehicle is together. Once the driver is in, this bar thing goes on. Nothing especially challenging in getting this part into place. Looking at this completed assembly, I'm sure you can see why it will be very hard to put the driver in later. I then glue that assembly into the lower hull, and it fits nicely. The recess on the right side of the inner hull acts as a kind of keying with the right side of the driver's area, and it's very easy to tell when it's located correctly. Next, I attach this rear plate to the rear, strangely enough. This is keyed so you can't place it too high up, though you could put it a bit low. Don't though. Push it up and use the keying to guide it into the correct position. Then come these boxes. I'm assuming these are for crew stowage, though maybe this is where the crew stores their jars of tears from their victims. The parts are easy enough to get into place, though they did require a little bit of cleanup before they would sit nicely. You don't want these to stick out too far from the sides of the hull or they're going to interfere with the side plates. I figured why not install the boxes and then put the lids on, but you could put the lids on before installing the boxes if you want. You do you. The hinges should face in towards the middle of the vehicle. Of course, do make sure that they're on straight. Then I install the rear of the fighting compartment. I had to do a little bit of sanding to get this part to sit neatly against the front of the engine deck, but that wasn't too hard. When Fog of War built this kit, he installed the front plate part before the sides to make it easier to line the sides up, and that seemed like a good idea, so I did that as well. This part is very easy to get into place. It more or less locks into the correct position on the hull. I think it was a good idea compared with what the instructions suggest. It looked to me like the sides might be a bit tricky to attach. Following the instructions is of course a good idea, but so is thinking for yourself and using your own powers of observation to decide when to be a rebel. Or in this case, copying somebody else who is being a rebel, I guess. Why not attach those side parts now? Not shown is the test fitting and sanding that I did. There was a fair bit of that because the part wanted to sit too far out from the sides. Eventually I got it to fit neatly enough though. It's not perfect, but it's decent enough. The left side was a much worse fit, and it took a lot more sanding, scraping and filing, but I did eventually get it to a point where the fit was acceptable. Again, not perfect, but it is okay. You could give these gaps some attention with sanding and putty, and it would probably look great. Then to fill the hole in the front of the Sexton, I add the transmission casing. Much better. The fit here was really tight. I even had to file down the sides of the part just to get it to fit between the tracks. That's why after test fitting I didn't pull the part off completely to add the glue. I just sort of slip it down, put the glue on and then push it back into place. Easy enough. This is the early version of the transmission casing, so it has rib parts, while the late version doesn't. It's a single piece. This and the track sets are pretty much the only difference between the early and late versions of the Sexton. Installing the ribs is just as easy as it looks. They go into the obvious slots on the front of the part, and the thinner, pointier end should be facing upwards. Now it's time for the gun. I did drill out the end of this, but I only made a fairly shallow hole. I was a bit concerned that I may cause damage and weakness by drilling in too far. It should be enough to hold some black wash though, which is about all we really need. The gun part looks pretty decent and its installation is simple. You sandwich it between these two, I guess you would call them gun shield parts? I'm not sure. Whatever they're called, all three parts go together nicely enough, and then that assembly can be installed. There's a fairly obvious mounting point for this. I press it down into place and position the gun in such a way that I think it looks sensible. It's not quite facing perfectly forwards, but it doesn't need to be. And that's the vehicle pretty much done, but there is some stowage to add, so let's do that. I start with this wire spool. I assume this is for linking the Sextons and their commander for communications without having to use radios. I'm not 100% sure that it has to go where I've placed it, but the instructions do point it out specifically, and it looks like a reasonable place for it, so that's where I put it. Looks very spooly. I then add this roll. I assume this is for covering the fighting compartment. This kind of just slots right into place where the instructions say to put it. I'm pretty sure you could place it elsewhere if you wanted to, though this does seem to be the most logical place for it. Then I put one of the two spare road wheels that come on the sprue here on the left side. This seemed like a good spot, and it helps to hide that there's a bit more of a gap under it than I think there really should be. Next, jerry cans. I put both of these on the rear stowage box things because that seems like a good place for them, and the instructions suggest they go there too. I'm not being very rebellious in this, am I? Like the other stowage items, these are optional. Maybe with the other Sextons in the box I'll do things differently. And now, the crew. There isn't really any assembly here except for this one figure, the gunner. He comes in two halves and he's easy enough to glue together. These did have fairly heavy mold lines on them, and I've done my best to clean them up. I'm not going to glue them into place here because I'll paint them separately one day. One day. It turns out that they're very hard to put into any sensible position without glue. They really don't want to just stand where I've put them, but I guess that's okay. They give you an idea of what they might look like, and for now, that's enough. As you can probably tell, that's the Plastic Soldier Company Sexton Mark II in 15mm scale complete. Sadly, I don't have anything to compare this model with, and I do believe this is the only model of this vehicle in plastic at this scale. Maybe if Battlefront do their own plastic version of this, I'll do a comparison. I have my doubts that will happen though. I'm pretty happy with how this Sexton has turned out. It looks quite neat and it's fairly well detailed, and I would say that it's a pretty decent representation of the real vehicle, especially at this small scale. There are some gaps where the side parts join the hull, but they're not as bad as they could have been, and they should be quite easy to fix. The build was pretty straightforward and fun, though the fit of the side parts was a bit of a pain in the arse. I had to do quite a bit of sanding and scraping there, which is a bit unusual for a Plastic Soldier Company kit. It's certainly not the worst thing, and I was obviously able to get the model together in the end. It was just a bit annoying. What really matters is the end result, and I think it's pretty good. What do you think? Do you find self-propelled artillery like this useful in games like Flames of War? Or do you hate it because it's artillery and you've got World of Tanks related trauma? Are you proud of me for not making super sensible jokes about the name Sexton? Sex. Let me know in the comments below. Once again, a huge thank you to Fog of War. I very much appreciate you sending me this kit, and I would like to once again encourage anyone who hasn't to go and check out his channel. He makes great videos, and I'm pretty sure if you like what I do, you'll like what Fog of War does too. Check the link in the description. And of course, if you haven't already, why not sub here on YouTube, follow me on social media, or watch me stream on Twitch. And if you really like what I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon, or perhaps by purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all of those things are in the description too. And as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other and thanks for watching. Farewell.